I'm Niklas. You might know me as DanishDebater on Twitter. Now, I'm going to look at a video that TheSocialApologist posted on YouTube 3 months ago. This video, he is retelling a conversation that someone had with an atheist, he himself being a theist, and retelling how the argument went, and then he makes a conclusion from it. I disagree with the conclusion, but, well, I'm an atheist, so fair enough. But I also think I know why I disagree, and why a lot of Christians would probably agree with him. So, to test this, I made a poll on Twitter and asked my Christian and theist followers and friends to vote and maybe comment on why they agreed or disagreed with him in his conclusion. So, we will take a look at the poll and we will take a look at his video. And then I will try to break down his argument and the conclusions and tell why I agree and disagree with it. But first I think we should hear his video from himself.
So this atheists and Christians are arguing about God's existence, right? And they're going back and forth in their arguments. And as they're going, the Christian realizes, well, the atheist isn't really responding to any of the arguments that he's presenting for God's existence. So eventually the Christian asks the atheist, he's like, hey, listen, if I were to present all the evidence that meet all your criteria for it to be right in order for you to believe in God's existence, so it meets all your criteria, would you become a Christian? And the atheist looks at him and he says, well, no. So the Christian turns to him and he tells him, well, you got to be honest with yourself. This isn't an intellectual issue then. It's a heart issue. You don't want to change because you don't want to be held accountable for your actions. You don't want to be held accountable to a higher power. It's not an intellectual issue anymore. It's not the best arguments are going to win anymore. It's not about what science points to.
So yeah, that was the video, pretty short and to the point. Now, I have to be clear here. I don't disagree with him that this conversation could have happened. Actually, I think it could very well have happened, because if I was asked the same question, I would answer the same way. Maybe not as smug as he made the atheist sound, but I would probably have answered the same. So, but I suspected that Christians would probably agree with him. So let's see. And well, it's a small sample size, right? 17 people. I only held the poll up for 24 hours and I don't have that big of a channel. So yeah, sure. But still, it shows what I suspected. The majority of Christians actually agreed with him. So now I'm going to break down the conversation and tell you why I think Christians shouldn't agree with him, and also tell how this argument could be improved so that the atheist should answer, yes, I would become a Christian. At least if he is intellectually honest with himself. So first, here's a transcript, and I hope it's correct because I did type it down myself. But let's try to break it down. So we have a premise here where he says, if you have all the evidence that God exists, all the evidence, and they meet your criteria, that's the premises, right? You have that. And would you then become a Christian? This could also be changed a little bit into a proposition, a premise, sorry. And the atheist answers, no, this is also a premise. And then we have his conclusion starts, well, you gotta be honest with yourself. Then it's broken into two parts. This isn't an intellectual issue then. And then the second part of it, no, it's not an intellectual issue anymore. It's not the best arguments aren't gonna win anymore. It's not about science pointing to. And then the video cuts off, but I'm pretty much guessing that he's saying it's not about the science pointing to God not existing. So that's a premise as well. And within it we have, it is a hard issue you don't want to change. We'll move this one down because it's a premise after the purple premise of intellectual issue. And then we have the last one, because you don't want to be held accountable for your actions. You don't want to be held accountable to a higher power. This is the last part of his conclusion. We can try to simplify this argument a bit. The part about being presented all the evidence that meets one's criteria basically ends up meaning that you know that God exists. If you have all the evidence and they meet all your criteria, then you know God exists. And would you become a Christian pretty much turns into and should become a Christian. That's the point. The Christians would expect N to become a Christian. if he knew that God exists. But N does not become a Christian. You gotta be honest with yourself. The first conclusion then turns into N is fooling himself. Now, this is the most nice way I could formulate this. It could be formulated worse, that he's dishonest and such, but I think fooling himself is fair enough here. This isn't an intellectual issue then. Can be turned into N is not using reason. It is a hard issue you don't want to change. Can be turned into N is using emotions. And lastly, because you don't want to be held accountable for your actions, you don't want to be held accountable to a higher power, could tell you that these emotions are some sort of fear or self-importance or arrogance or something like that. I don't want to put words into his mouth, but these are some of the emotions that you could reason from what was said there. So now we have a simplified argument, right? N knows God exists. N should become a Christian. N does not become a Christian. N is fooling himself. N is not using reason. N is using emotion. And N's emotion are fear, self-importance, arrogance, etc. Now, I think this is flawed. And I think this is flawed because of the second premises. N should become a Christian. This is not within the argument. It has not been shown that N should become a Christian. And if this does not hold, then the conclusion does not hold. So let's try to forget everything below the second premise, and let's take a look at that alone. So the second premise becomes a conclusion that the Christians already have, but that the atheists don't share, and this is where it goes wrong. Because premise 1 is fair. With all that evidence, then N should know that God exists. So N knows God exists. But it does not follow that N should become a Christian now. So let's take a look at it. Well, why should he become a Christian? Is it because God should be followed? Well, that has not been argued. Is it because God is worthy of being followed? Well, even if God is worthy, that doesn't mean that you have to follow him. What about God is good? Now, I think we can work from this if we say God is good. But we also have to add the hidden premise then that you ought to follow what is good. And I think that's a fair premise to add, but we have to add it. And we also have to add that N knows that God is good. It's not enough that God is good. N has to know it. And N has to ought to follow that which is good. Now these three hidden premises can be turned into one premise if we know the hidden premises, and that is N knows he ought to follow God. So now we have N knows God exists. N knows he ought to follow God. N should become a Christian. Now there's also another hidden argument in this, and that is that the God that N knows exists is the Christian God. But I think that was implicit in the conversation since the Christian is already talking about it. So now we have a working syllogism here, and we can pop it right back into our original argument. So now the argument looks: premise 1, N knows God exists. Premise 2, N knows he ought to follow God. Premise 3, N should become a Christian. Premise 4, N does not become a Christian. And from this we draw our conclusion. But I don't think that the first part of the conclusion, N is fooling himself, is fair at any point in this, because we don't know N's internal states. Maybe N is absolutely aware that he should become a Christian and that it would make sense for him to become a Christian, but is holding back for other reasons. It might be pure stubbornness. He's not fooling himself in that case. He's just stubborn. N is not using reason. Seems fair now. N is using emotions. Also seems fair now. N's emotion are fear, self-important, arrogance. Does not seem fair. We can't again read the internal state of N. So at the end, this is the argument that I think you could make that would be fair. N knows God exists. N knows he ought to follow God. N should become a Christian. And if N then does not become a Christian, conclusion, N is not using reason, N is using emotions, would be fair. But I would contest the fourth premises. Because if I knew God exists, if I knew I ought to follow him with those hidden premises that we talked about, then I knew I should become a Christian, and I would become a Christian. So, just to reiterate, N knows God exists. N knows he ought to follow God. N should become a Christian. Could be rephrased as, if I gave you all the evidence that God existed, and that they were all satisfactory to you. And if I could show you that God is both good and ought to be followed, again fully to your satisfaction, would you become a Christian? If all these criteria were met, then I personally would become a Christian. But the core issue is the one view that was never mentioned in the argument, and that most atheists do not share with Christians, that God is both good and ought to be followed. I do hope you liked the video and the presentation. Please, whether you're a theist, atheist, do comment on it. Tell me what was good, what was bad, what could I do better. This is my first attempt at a semi-long length video and at video editing, and yeah, that's a tough cookie. Have a nice one. Best regards.